Hello, I'm Alan Morinis, and I want to talk to you today about a Mussar practice known as Kabbalot. That's the plural. The singular is Kabbalah, which may be a word that you're familiar with in terms of the Jewish mystical practice of Kabbalah. Both that and this, which have nothing to do with each other, get their names from the Hebrew word likabel, which means to receive. Now, in the case of what I'm talking about, what's received is essentially an exercise, a practice that one does in real life, in real time, in order to work on a particular inner trait. The pattern of Mussar practice is generally to work on one trait at a time. Sometimes people work on that trait for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, sometimes even longer. My own practice is to work for 1 week. At most, I'll go for 2 weeks, but I know people do longer, but I don't. In that period, one is doing all kinds of things to become more aware of that trait, understand that trait better, understand how that trait plays out in your life. Are you open-handed? Are you tight-fisted? What brings about your open-handedness? What brings about your tight-fistedness? In the case of generosity, or is it gratitude? Or is it joy? Or is it jealousy or envy or whatever you may be working on? In that period, certain practices will be introspective, like journaling and some others, but the Mussar teachers also assigned practices that one would do in everyday life in order to test and stretch in real terms the quality that you're working on. This was based on their idea, their core theory, that ideas, conceptual notions, are not really transformative. The point of Mussar practice is to really change, and the Mussar teacher said that ideas which are held in the mind are not very powerful and not very transformative. Experience is what transforms, and one of the best ways to get experience is in the real world. So no matter what quality a person is working on, that quality can be expressed in an exercise, a practice that is done during the day in the real world for experience of what that contains for that person. In the Mussar yeshivas of the 19th century and the early 20th century, there was usually a spiritual supervisor, a mashgiach, and he would run the groups of Mussar students, and he would assign, or the group would assign, the exercise that was to be done for that particular quality, and hence the name Kabbalah or Kabbalot. The students, the practitioners, received upon themselves what was assigned to work on that particular quality. I'll give you a few examples. Take a practice like generosity. Let's imagine that somebody says, or becomes aware, or perhaps got assigned, to practice more generosity. You may think you're a generous person, and you may have an experience like mine, where once I was walking into the drugstore, my local drugstore, and out front there was a homeless man who stationed himself there. And every time I went by, I would give a quarter or 50 cents. I was pretty consistent, and I felt I'm generous. And one time I'm walking into the drugstore, and the man in front of me gave a $5 bill into the hat, and then he stopped and he said, made eye contact, and he said to the homeless man, "How'd you end up on the street?" And by the time I came out of the drugstore, having done my whole shopping, they were still in conversation. And I saw through that experience that I had room to grow. In the working on the quality of generosity, the kind of Kabbalah that a person might take would be to do 3 generous acts a day. When I started teaching Mussar and I started giving practices like this, in the first instance around generosity, what I would assign is 5 practices a day. And then we would get emails back from students saying, I can't do 5. I can't find 5 opportunities to be generous. I'm running down the street with dollar bills in my hand trying to give them away. And so we scaled it back to 3. And imagine in the day, you have, as your practice, find 3 opportunities to do a generous act. Now, one of the things about cultivating generosity is that what we're cultivating is a quality of the heart. It's not a quality of financial management. And so there are many ways to be generous that don't involve money. You can be generous with your words. You can be generous with your possessions. You can be generous with your property. There are many ways to be generous. And a typical Mussar practice would say, over the course of this week, every day, those 3 practices that I do, those 3 exercises, will be in a different area. So one day, all my practices will be acts of financial generosity. One day, I'll give away or be generous with my property. Now, if you wonder what that is, just think about how many items of clothing you might have hanging in your closet that you have not worn in the last 5 years and probably, highly probably, will not wear for the next 5 years. So go through your closet and give those away. I had an instance last year when we sold our house and downsized, which brought me to my lovely new office. And I was looking through our stuff, having to dispose of things. I found a box of flower pots under the back stairs. And, you know, the tendency is just to want to throw them in the trash. But I thought, no. And in fact, it was in a week that I was working on generosity. I said, no, I can give these away. For somebody, they will be valuable. And so I looked up on the internet and I found the Begonia and Geranium Society and phoned and said, I have these flower pots. And the woman on the other end said, we'd be delighted to have them. And so my generosity that day was with flower pots. But it's equally generous to pick up the phone and make a phone call to someone, or to care about someone, or to be generous in whatever way is giving with no expectation of return. So those sorts of exercises, giving away a certain amount of money every day, or giving away of your own possessions, or sharing your possessions open-handedly, that would be an example of a Kabbalah. And in the case of generosity, it's easy to understand how you could form an exercise. Let's say you're working on a quality like gratitude. And there too, you would set yourself a practice to look for situations in which you can say thank you to people. And they can be reactive situations. Be on the lookout for someone who opens a door for you, or lets you in traffic, or helps you with something. And be sure to be effusive in your gratitude. I've seen in my own experience, I know through my children's experience, they're often mystified that people don't say thank you. And I remember one of my daughters saying, it's free. Like, why don't people do it? Because if you do it, you end up with more of cooperation and gratitude coming back from the other person. It's just, it builds relationship. It's very fruitful. So it's kind of mystifying that people don't do it more. But another way of doing a Kabbalah in that same area is to say, every day this week, I'm going to look back into my past and I'm going to find someone who has really contributed to my life. A teacher, a family member, a friend, a coworker. Maybe they're not in your life even anymore. And I'm going to reach out to that person and express my gratitude. In the case of generosity or gratitude, or it could be joy with your portion, or it could be whatever you might be working on, whatever trait is on your agenda at that moment. You're exercising an inner muscle. You're giving yourself experiences that will inform that inner being about what's possible for you. I want to give one more example and then talk a little bit more about how the Mussar teacher saw this. Some of the inner qualities are not so concrete as generosity or gratitude or patience. And I'm thinking of qualities like trusting God or faith or yirah, which can mean awe or fear or reverence, or all the 3 of them wrapped up together. And the working on those you might think is hard to find a Kabbalah. And when we have taught in the Mussar Institute qualities like bitachon, trusting God, one of the practices that we've given, exercises, has been to punctuate your statements of intention with a notion like God willing. I'm going to go to the store, God willing, and I'm going to buy milk, God willing, and I'll have enough money, God willing. And so you express the sense of being in connection with the power of the divine in the world, and that you are not an agent acting in isolation, but that everything depends on the divine will. And in that sense, you cultivate within yourself a sense of bitachon. So that's a good example of a Kabbalah. Once I was teaching that very Kabbalah, and somebody said, that doesn't fit my theology. I don't see God in that way, as being like that or operating like that. And yet a person who is trying to cultivate that inner quality of trust is not required to have a specific theology. Theology is very often a work in progress, and so it can't be prescribed. And the person came back and said, what if every day this week I did something that was beyond the boundaries of my comfort zone? I pushed myself over my comfort zone. And I thought about it and I said, yes, that would be something that could well cultivate trust, because what keeps us from stretching, we think it's beyond our comfort zone. That may just be a matter of having too narrow boundaries. We may be perfectly capable beyond that comfort zone. And so trust is what allows us to step over that line and realize our potential through action. And all of the Kabbalot are about putting midot into action. Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe, who was a great Mussar teacher who died in 2005, he's very much of our present world, he understood and drew on earlier teachings to say what this is about is a process that he called hislamdus or hitlamdut. He would have said hislamdus. Lamed is to learn, and hitlamed, lehitlamed, is to teach yourself. It's the reflexive form of the verb, to teach yourself. And what you teach yourself from is your own experience. You might say, I can't do that, or I'm not habituated to do that, or I'm resistant to doing that, be that give away money, or express gratitude, or do something beyond your comfort zone, or learn how to be patient, whatever it may be in experience. You need to try it out in the real world and learn from your experience. The experience in real life becomes the basis of hitlamdut, of teaching yourself. And Rabbi Wolbe said this was his major teaching. This is what he wanted his students to become proficient at, was putting themselves into the world in real ways, attempting to stretch themselves, to reach up to their potential, see what happens, learn from the experience. It's not about ambition. The Mussar teachers also have a principle of not undertaking practices that are a bigger stretch than have a high likelihood of succeeding. It is much better to succeed rather at a lower level, a smaller grasp, than to reach big and to accomplish nothing, and in fact to become discouraged by that. So the trick in the Kabbalah is to find the level of stretch that really does give you a workout, but is not so far, is not such a big reach as to invite failure, nor is it so close to home and safe that it's no stretch at all. So in each case, for whatever you may be working on, whichever trait, try to find an exercise and put it into practice in your life and see what you learn. You'll learn a lot.